Chapter 11 Infinite Worries Lamare Amark. The night was warm, and there was not much air circulating in Wawang village. I felt tired from the day's journey to the Kino Palace, but I knew it was the emotional burden that caused my weariness. It was almost midnight when I arrived home, and Kino was unable to wait for me. Still, as a habit, it was his room that I checked first. There were no candles left burning in his room, just like I told him, to avoid an accidental fire. Inside his room, he was sleeping soundly. One of the windows was left open, and the moons peeked through the curtains. I walked closer to bed and tucked him in. "Good night, my dear Kino. Everything will be better in the morning," I whispered to him before kissing his head. My stomach grumbled from only having a slice of bread on the way home, but there was no time for me to prepare some soup anymore. I yawned. I opened the door, which was just across Kino's door, and slipped inside. I only took about 3 steps before reaching the bed. It was a tight fit inside this room, which was so unlike my room in the Kino Palace before, but I have no reason to complain. Kino is alive. We are together. To me, living in a small cottage is such a small price to pay in exchange for our lives. I lay in bed, pulled the blanket over me, and sighed. It was not an easy life, but nobody ever said that life would be like that of a princess for everyone all the time. Right now, I can do some chores. I can cook, do the laundry, and go out to the market to trade. I can even grow some shrubs, which was such a huge accomplishment for me. But what exactly was I doing with my life, with Kino's life? Was this how it was going to be for the rest of our lives? The gods would have been kinder to me if they had made me the daughter of a farmer from the start. I would have been better equipped to do physical labor. I closed my eyes and yawned again. Even though I was tired, I tried not to sleep so much because my dreams often bothered me in my sleep. Lately, there were just so many of them that it was hard to escape from them when I woke up. I sat up and was awakened upon remembering the dream I had last night. It was a recounting of my life. Back when I was still a princess, and right before I was thrown away outside the palace gates. What would tonight bring me? And why do I even dream of these horrid memories? I did not realize that I had fallen quickly into sleep until I felt my head sliding to the side of my bed. I caught my head and opened my eyes, yawning again. I should see a healer tomorrow. Or maybe a seer. Someone who could tell me what all of these dreams meant. With that thought, I had drifted off to sleep again, and no sooner had I done so when I found myself reunited with my dreams about my life moon turns ago. The moons reflected too much of the sun's rays, and it was hot in Akea. Lately, it has always been like this, and I longed for winter to come. I removed the scarf covering my neck, wrapped it over my head, and rode on. In a few hours, I would find Timbuk Lasses waiting for me at the foot of Mount Rikas, and we would climb the mountain together, as he wanted to show me a more accessible trail to Nivadan. I stopped and dismounted Healer, holding his reins close. A familiar set of footsteps approached me. Soft-heeled sandals made an impression on the dry leaves that gathered on the ground. I was smiling even as I was lifted in the air, and a face materialized in front of me. I found myself looking at Timbuk's green eyes, and I kissed him. "I missed you too," he said before putting me down. I entwined my fingers through his. "Let's go." He took Healer's reins, and we started climbing the mountain on foot. "You said you'd show me an easier trail." Timbuk laughed. "Well, this is the steep part. Don't worry, as soon as we cross the creek, it will mostly be flatlands." It was still a tough climb, but I did not mind. I wore the soft sandals he gave me when I last visited him. He said that the sandals were specially made for Nivan so that the sounds would be muted, and when they became invisible, their presence could barely be heard. I liked the sandals. They were soft against my soles and fit snugly to my feet. "Can we rest for a while?" I asked when he showed no signs of stopping after an hour of climbing. "The faster we travel, the sooner we'll get to the flatlands," he said. He studied me for a minute and saw that I was not used to trekking for so long and conceded. "All right, let me find a good spot for resting." He pulled at Healer's reins to make the bay follow, tying the rope around a nearby tree trunk. Then he took my hand, and we walked to a shaded spot under the same tree. "We're close to a creek. Come on," he said. We walked another 100 yards or so. "I'm tired. Where are we going?" I looked around. The path seemed familiar to me, like I had been here before. Is this the secret passage? Timbuk looked at me and smiled. Yes, you've been here before, he said. Which was why I didn't have second thoughts revealing myself to you. Because only non-Nibbins with pure hearts can find the secret passage. We continued walking, and after a while, he added, did you know that the oldest of the Amark bloodline was the one who found this passage? He shared the secret with the Nivens. Since then, Nivens trusted the Emperor with their powers. Only the Emperors know what we are capable of. He paused, and those who find the secret passage on their own. Now, that was something new. This was never mentioned anywhere by palace scholars. I was mulling things so intently in my head that I had not noticed that I stopped in my tracks. Timbuk was now staring at me. Are you still tired? If you keep on complaining, I'll have to carry you. No one's stopping you. I blurted out, a light giggle in between. He smiled, scooped me up, and carried me for the rest of the trail. I was hanging down his shoulders, my buttocks thrust up in the air. I hit him lightly on the back, but he just laughed at my efforts. Now, you'll get to rest your legs, and your mouth, he said, laughing. Put me down. I giggily yelled, although it was difficult with my head hanging down his back and my brown hair dangling down in front of my face. He would accede, so I stopped protesting and decided to relax my arms. After a while, he put me down, and I was back on my feet again. Happy? He asked, teasing. No. After you maltreated me like that? I was grinning all over. No, I mean, look around you. The water in the creek was crystal clear, and fish swam beneath the surface as the lilies covered the opposite bank's waters. The breeze cut through the canopy of giant trees that marked the entrance to the secret passage. It felt surreal to stand here again. The bright sun overhead made me appreciate the beauty of the place even more. Up for a swim? He asked. I loved the water and found freedom whenever I swam. I could only say yes at that moment. I removed my clothes and ran towards the creek. When I jumped in, the freezing water chilled me to my bones. He still didn't follow. What are you waiting for? The water's nice, I reassured. Nice? Your chin's shaking, he said, chuckling. I rolled my eyes at him and dived under the water. When my head bobbed, I saw him taking his clothes off. He soon joined me. I did not know how it all happened. I was married to Wind, but Timbuk was different. With Timbuk, I felt free. I enjoyed my life the way I thought I deserved to. So in that creek, while Timbuk and I were relishing the quietude, I fell prey to the Niven's charms and lost myself to him. I never regretted it, even if it meant losing myself to another man. Was it because of love, or was my younger self so easy to tempt? But so soon, my moments with Timbuk were over. The surroundings changed around me, and it dawned on me that I had been dreaming all along. It left me confused because the dream seemed so real. I was back in the Canellan Palace outside Wind's chambers, and I could hear him shouting. I could not make out most of the words, but he must have been angry. The sky outside was dark, and I guessed it was his doing. It had been more than 7 months since the last time I met with Timbuk. The Emperor is gone? Where to? And you let him go? Wind's voice was followed by a loud crash of the soldier's body against the palace wall as he, in his rage, flung the soldier using the air. Saul was by Wind's side. She had her eyes closed as though in deep concentration. He had no control over what happened. It wasn't his fault, she said calmly. That's the problem. He had no control. Because of that, everything could be ruined. Wind's voice was still loud, but it had lost some of the edges. Speaking with Saul did him wonders. Husband, what's wrong? I asked. They looked at me at the same time. Nothing. It's not a woman's business, he said impatiently. I cocked my eyebrows at him. But you were discussing this with Saul. Saul is a friend, someone I trust. Blood rose to my head, and I wanted to tell him that I was his wife, not merely a friend, and that he could trust me with whatever it was he was planning. At that moment, I wanted to slap Saul and drag her outside, but I was afraid that Wind would lose his temper if Saul were not around. Saul's face blanched, probably in pain. Wind told me that she harbored no feelings towards him, but from how her face shadowed when she heard him refer to her as a friend, I knew that my husband was wrong. I was younger than both of them by many moon turns, but I was no fool. "Where is my father?" I asked more sternly this time. "He was out with his royal guards earlier," Win said, speaking slowly as if contemplating something. "I didn't chance upon him last night." "Did you?" I asked. With a slow tip of his head, he answered, "It was already dawn when he came back." "And he had to leave again so early?" Win swallowed, but his face was schooled. "Sometimes, an emperor has to do what he has to do. He doesn't tell me his whereabouts." "I have not heard from the emperor either," Saul said. Saul's eyes did not give her away, but then again, they hardly ever did. With her mask of serenity, it was almost always impossible to tell if she was lying. "I don't need to explain to both of you. Leave me alone," Win said. I glanced at the soldier sprawled on the floor and knew better than to argue. I would have to ask my father to provide better protection for the palace's soldiers. Even with their powers, the soldiers cannot use them against the ones in authority, or they could be charged with treason. I touched my belly and felt my cheeks heating up. I pressed my palms to where the baby inside my belly kicked, and hope ignited inside of me. "When you're out in this world, Wind will love me more. Maybe he will become a better father to you than he is a husband to me," I said softly, encouraging the baby in my womb to kick again, but my baby remained still. I turned and left the chambers. Back in my room, I knew what I should do. I closed my eyes and prayed to the gods first. Then on air, I wrote, "Father, come back." The burning words hung in the air, and I stared at them as they slowly dissipated. My words were so powerful they could make things unfold almost magically. When after a few hours, my father did not show up, I told myself that he could be somewhere in the Akea Islands. He loved fishing, and that was where he went to release stress. Maybe he was traveling, and he was on his way back now. It could take a while before he reached the palace grounds, but the hours of waiting turned into days and days into weeks, and my father did not set foot in the palace again. I climbed the stairs to Wind's chambers only to find him gone. The halls were quiet, and there were only a few palace guards. I clenched my fists in frustration. Why would the soldiers leave the palace unguarded? Reducing the number of soldiers could pose a threat to the royal family. Catching my breath, I finally reached Saul's room. I knocked 3 times before I heard her voice. "Come in," she said. I pushed the heavy doors, and it was quite an effort for me. I missed the soldier who usually guarded her door. "Saul," I said. Upon seeing me, Saul stood up quickly. "Your Highness," Saul said, curtsying. Instantly, a certain level of calmness engulfed me, and a wave of tranquility replaced the panic I had over my missing father. "The Emperor has not yet returned. Have you received any word about him?" She looked at me for a long time before answering, "I'm sorry, Your Highness, but I have nothing to offer you. It's been weeks, and I am also worried." I choked on a sob because I did not know what had happened to my father. Should I tell Saul what my power was? Could I trust her? Could I tell her that I was afraid for my father because I summoned him to come back, yet he did not return? I could control my voice, but my eyes were not strong enough to hold back the well of tears that had been trying to escape me since that day I penned my father to return. Saul stood up from where she was sitting and held my hands. "Your Highness, please let me calm you. The baby should not be subject to such anxiety. How could someone as delightful as Saul love someone as cruel and heartless as my husband? Was she an enemy, or was she the ally I had been looking for all along?" My heart lightened upon Saul's touch. My worries were pushed back somewhere far in my mind where my emotions could not reach them. "Thank you," I said. "I am at your service, Your Highness, inasmuch as I am pledged to the Emperor of Akea," she said. "Now that I am calmer, I can think better. Somebody needed to know that my father was in trouble. Should I call for the head of the palace soldiers? For the war generals? For the advisor to the emperor?" But there were not as many soldiers in the palace right now, at least no one who was high-ranking enough to have any authority. That left me with Saul, another person I believed had secrets as deep as mine. The emperor is in trouble. I know it. I can feel it inside my heart. He had not returned even when I expected him to. Saul regarded me carefully. "What do you mean even when you expected him to? How thrilling it must be to possess a power such as hers." I told her something I believed was of great significance, yet her face did not show any emotion. "I know. I just know, I said, still indecisive about revealing my power. Then I can't help you, Your Highness. What is it, hearsay? Did you chance upon the cooks gossiping in the kitchen? No. I protested, shaking my head. The tears were back. I asked him to come home, and he did not return. How did you ask him if he's not even in the palace? Before I knew it, I was telling Saul everything. What my power was. What I could do with it. How for too long now I'd been expecting my father to come back, and still, I have not heard a word from him. She did not seem to believe me, so I told her, walk to the door. Saul only looked at me. Why, Your Highness? She asked. Exactly the reaction I was expecting, but when I write the words down. I started spelling the words out in the air with my finger, then I continued, you will have no option but to follow. I looked up to find that she had stood up and walked to the door. She was standing beside it, her mouth slightly agape. It would undoubtedly take a lot to surprise this woman. And I had done it with such ease. Goodness gracious. Your power. It's, I don't know. Unheard of, Saul said. Nobody knows about it except my father, Wind, and now. You. Saul shivered. Finally, I was able to break into her calmness. And that's how you knew the Emperor was in trouble, she murmured, considering what this meant. I nodded, and tears rolled down my cheeks again. Please, help him. I'm with child. I cannot organize and lead a search party for him. She looked at me with sad eyes. Of course, Your Highness. I'll talk to Wind and the general so that a search party can be deployed immediately. The general is with my father, I believe, I said. Right. That leaves only Wind. I'll see what I can do. No, I said, obviously alarmed. Saul looked at me with questioning eyes. I stared at her defiantly, bending her to my will. I may have spoken to her like a friend, but I was still her princess, and with my father missing, I was the first in command in Akea. She could not go against my wishes. I understand, Your Highness, she said. I stood up, and after she curtsied to me, I left hurriedly, caressing my belly, trying to spare my baby of any worry. I overcame my fear and remained calm for the child because the nurses had said that whatever emotion I felt, my baby would share it. I could not stand here and wait for Saul's advice, though. Timbuktu. He could help. His people too. It would be easy for them since they could make themselves invisible and search far and wide undetected. Since no outsider knew what their powers were, it would only be more to their advantage. I have always wondered how Nibbins got away with never registering their powers in the Akea books. I asked my father about it a long time ago, and he only told me that it was an agreement between the first emperor of Akea and the elder of Nivedon. I could not understand, since the agreement seemed to have been a threat to the empire at the time, but he only told me that it was a pact made between the strongest bloodlines, which meant that the vow posed no threat to each other if they held their ends of the agreement. The story that Timbuktu shared about the secret passage made the mystery much clearer. When I reached my room, I changed into my riding clothes. Lucia Sitter, my nurse, was quick to help me get dressed. Your Highness, it's beyond me to ask, but I would like to hear none of your protestations, I said sternly. I felt ashamed of my actions. My father had always told me to treat the servants kindly, and here I was, snapping at one of them. If he were around, he would advise me to not only apologize verbally but to make up for my harsh words through actions. I grabbed Lucia's hand before she left, gave it a squeeze, and said, "Your services are always appreciated." "Thank you." It worked the way my father told me it would. Red blossomed on Lucia's cheeks, and she gave me a quick smile before she curtsied and walked away. I took a cloak and pulled it over my head to keep my face hidden. There was no need for it because Wind was not around. Saul didn't know I was planning on going out, and there were hardly any soldiers to pay me any mind. But lately, I noticed it was becoming essential to be careful. Heading straight for the stables, I looked for Healer. I saw the stable boy as he stood up. God, he was not pleasant to look at. He was huge and had broad shoulders that loomed over me. Apart from his gigantic size, his face was littered with scars that made him look even more menacing. "Please saddle Healer," I commanded. "Madam, this is the princess's horse. I can't let you ride him," he said in a voice that was so low I could only compare it to the bumblebees buzzing, an entire hive of them. He puffed on the tobacco that he was holding and blew it out. My stomach almost turned when I smelled it. I pulled down the cloak, revealing my face, and glared at him. The stable boy's eyes rounded as the recognition of who I was hit him full force. His mouth opened, and I could smell the strong scent of tobacco even more. Before I could say another word, he bowed and said, "Your Highness, forgive me. I'll saddle your horse immediately." He threw the tobacco at his feet and quickly stomped on it to put it out before turning away to saddle Healer. In a few minutes, he was handing me the reins. "Your Highness, I don't know where you're going, but riding could be dangerous for the baby," he said. I appreciated his concern, but I had to be steadfast in seeking help from the Nivens. It was only expected of a princess to search for her father emperor. "Take no worry about it," I said as I started galloping away from him. The road to Nivedon took longer for me than usual. Maybe it was because of my bulging stomach. Perhaps it was the anxiety building up inside me. Either way, riding a horse has become a challenging activity for me lately. The baby kicked, protesting against the sudden jostling disruption to its otherwise serene life. Today, something seemed to be wrong, but I could not put my finger on it. I saw horsemen approaching, galloping away from Mount Recus. I steered Healer away, hiding from the soldiers. As they passed by behind a swath of trees where I hid, one soldier glanced back but did not see me. Overhead, I saw trails of clouds pass by as though they were chariots, and from a distance, I caught sight of many soldiers riding with wind. The Emperor's soldiers did not usually frequent Nivedon. When the horses' galloping grew softer, I came out of my hiding place and continued my journey. It could still be hours before I reached Nivedon. I had to act fast. I came across a creek and filled my water bottle first. I had left the palace in such haste that I forgot to bring food, and with water being my only salvation from hunger, I drank greedily before mounting Healer again. When I was nearer the valley, I noticed something different. The ground showed signs of flooding. There were puddles all around, and the earth was as soft as clay. I tightened my hold on the reins and galloped, but I could feel Healer's pace slowing as the mud seemed to suck the horse's hooves. A trail of smoke rose in the air, and my heart stopped. I kicked Healer harder, and she resisted against the muddy road, fighting her way through the slick. It was dusk when I finally reached the center of Nivedon. Maybe it was the dankness or the darkness, or both, which made my heart sink deeper. There was a charred pile of something unrecognizable in the middle of the town, its foul stench infecting the air. I breathed through my mouth to drive the disgusting odor away, but I was unable to sustain it for long. I ended up with my stomach heaving as I searched for Nivens. There was no one around. Nothing in the place stirred. I looked above and wondered how long I would have before the horizon got darker, and when I realized how short a time I had before the light winked out, I panicked. "Timbuktu?" I yelled. I dismounted Healer, no longer caring to rein her in. "Timbuktu?" I shouted. "Timbuktu?" Only the echoes of my voice acknowledged my presence. I ran all the way to Timbuktu's treehouse. "Where are you?" I said desperately. I climbed to reach the ropes securing the makeshift ladder and managed to pull it down, climbing as fast as I could, unmindful of my belly. When I was inside his house, it was the usual, spotless, like it had been slept in a day or two ago and cleaned up after. Hope flowed inside my chest. "Timbuktu? Where are you?" I shouted again. I sat on his chair, touching the leather that covered the armrest. A moment's pause brought to my mind the vacated Canellan Palace halls. How it was stripped of its soldiers. Then, the sight across the towns that I passed, the air that was weighted with gloom, the soldiers that I ran into on my way here, the trail of clouds overhead with wind and his soldiers, and the mud, the puddles, and the signs of flooding all over. I looked outside the window and stared at some fallen trees until my gaze fell once again on the burnt mess in the middle of the town and saw something white protruding from that pile. From a distance, I could not quite make out what it was. I squinted, and when my sight cleared, I found myself staring at a skull. Shivers ran up and down my spine, chill coursed through my blood, and goosebumps covered my arms. I doubled over, and falling to my knees, vomited as it hit me that the source of the foul stench was burnt flesh. I stood up on weak knees, trying to regain my composure. "No!" I shouted shrilly as I climbed down. "Hello?" No one answered. "Please. Is anybody alive?" I paused to listen, but there was no response. Even the usual melodic chirping of the birds was nowhere to be heard. The silence hovered like it was mourning the death of Nivedon. My baby kicked. I touched my belly. Be calm, dearest. It's going to be all right, I told my baby, although I knew nothing would ever be the same again. Nivedon was lost. No survivors? I shouted again. Listened. Shouted. Then I ran like a crazy woman around Nivedon, searching for any indication that there were still Nivens alive. Now, no one could help me locate my father, Nordsom. Not without the Nivens. I was close to tearing at my hair. The desire to use my power beckoned, and I willingly gave in to the temptation. I crouched down, and in the mud, I wrote, Timbuktu, come back to me. I looked around, wanting to see a familiar set of footsteps mark the ground around me, but there was none. I pulled tightly at my cloak that had gone muddy after all the running that I did. I could not give up this easily. I climbed up another house. Is anybody home? I asked. There was no one inside. I slumped on the floor, losing strength. Nobody was home. No one would ever be home again. Timbuktu. I shouted one last time, hoping to be answered. I paused, listening to my surroundings, straining my ears to pick up the slightest of sounds. And then I heard a baby cry. The cries started in one house. I stood up and looked around, trying to figure out where the baby's cry came from. Another one cried from a different house. I hurriedly went down and ran to the source of the calls, but before I could climb, they were gone, replaced by crying from another house. I ran towards its source again, but the same thing happened. Finally, I was able to catch up with the sound of the baby's cries. I climbed up, almost slipping because my arms and legs were already too tired to support my weight. I entered the house, but to my dismay, there was no baby. I looked inside the rooms, and there was no one. I shivered, fearing the worst. The place that had once been populated by the ghost-like Nivens was now haunted by actual ghosts of the dead Nivens. The crying did not stop. It tore at my ears until I could not stand it any longer. The last sliver of light was starting to fade, and the moon's glow cast shadows all around me. Healer was nowhere to be found. I searched for any indication of where she could be, but her hoofs were like any other horses, and below, along the muddy streets of Nivedon, there were too many tracks for me to guess which one was Healer's. The coldness of the ground seeped through my sandals. The foul stench of dead bodies filled the air. My empty stomach complained. I gripped my dress and inhaled deeply. I hope that I can make my strength come back to me. Everywhere I looked, shadows loomed, and fear started to conquer me. I was certain that I would collapse, and only the gods would know what would happen next should I spend the night here. I slumped on a fallen tree, gasping for breath. When I glanced above, I wanted to shout, but when I opened my mouth to cast my grief, no words came out. Instead, tears coursed down my cheeks. I was crying for my father, Nordsom, for Nivedon, and for Timbuktu. I shuddered and my shoulders started shaking, sobs racking my entire body. When I thought I could not take it anymore, I gave in to nausea that was rapidly enveloping me. Nothing mattered anymore. Even this baby inside me would no longer see any future in Akea. The chaos had started. My father told me not to meddle with the future, not to use my power to change the events. Lying here in the mud, I thought to myself that maybe I should have when I could still have made a difference. I should have trusted my instincts and believed my gut when I thought Wind to be a vile creature. But his charms, they drew me to him. Tears continued to sting my eyes. Your Highness, I heard a soft rumbling and instantly opened my eyes. Let's go home. I'll bring you back to the palace safely, the stable boy said, and surprised as I was to see him, I had no energy left in me to ask him how he found me. His strong arms wrapped around me, and we started the journey back to Canella. I did not know what the future held, but I vowed I would use my power for good from now on. I hoped there was still time. I was unconscious for the rest of the journey. It could have been because of tiredness. Or maybe it was finding security in this stable boy's arms that finally took my senses away from the world. I opened my eyes and found my body drenched with sweat. It was a nightmare. Again. Like the ones I had been having these past few months. They always brought back memories of the past. The sad ones. Those that I try to bury deep inside. I stood up and went to the kitchen to get a glass of water. On my way back to the room, I stopped in front of Kino's door. I turned the doorknob and peeked inside. He was still curled up in his bed, fast asleep. His feet were not covered with the blanket because he had grown taller, and I had not yet made enough coins to buy us new sheets. I went inside and tucked him in, careful not to wake him. He stirred and turned to face me, but he was still asleep. I touched his face and brushed brown hair away from his forehead. He had my hair, but that was the only thing he got from me. Awake, he was the spitting image of his father. I dropped a soft kiss against his forehead. After that, I stood up to leave. "Nightmare again, Mother?" he asked sleepily. "No. I was just thirsty," I said, not wanting to worry him. "I know you're having nightmares because you talk in your sleep." It was dark, and the shadows covered my face, but I felt myself blushing furiously. "Sleep now, Kino. Let's talk in the morning." I turned around and went back to my room to rest. I was unaware that the nightmare still awaited me as my body hit the cold, wooden bed that night. The next time I opened my eyes, I was naked under the sheets inside my room in the Kino Palace. My body was sore all over. As soon as I stirred, Lucia immediately got up to attend to me. "Your Highness, please remain in bed. I've called a healer," she said. It was cold, so I hugged the blankets tighter as I stood up. Lucia was quick enough, and I had to struggle with her before I finally managed to get out of the room. "Your Highness, please. The healer will be here as soon as I've sent word. Please stay in bed." I ignored her, pulled my skirt up, and walked faster. Was I ready to face my husband? There was no room for these thoughts anymore because I soon found myself in front of the chambers. The guards greeted me, bowed, and opened the doors for me. "What did you do to Nivedin?" I shouted. Wind looked up. "What a pleasant greeting to your husband," he said coldly. I fumed inside. I controlled my voice before speaking again. "I saw you with palace soldiers leaving the province. A place that's now dead. I know about your whereabouts, wife. How dare you leave the palace in your condition? If something happened to the baby, to my heir, your beautiful head could end up on a pike. How dare you speak to me like that?" I shouted. The soldiers tensed. The sounds of swords unsheathing filled the air. I did not know who they were for, Wind or me. Wind's voice became softer. "My wife, there are things that I have to do as an emperor. Things that you may find repulsive. But the truth is, your father did them too. To preserve what is good for the land." "You refer to yourself as the emperor?" "There is no other way. You will understand." Before I could stop myself, I flung myself at him, slapping him on both cheeks. The third time that I raised my hand to do it again, he caught my wrist. "This is the only time I'll let this pass because I'm not yet declared all over the land. The next time you do this," he paused, shaking his head slightly before adding, "No, there will be no next time." A wave of air enveloped me and lifted me from the floor. Wind was glaring at me, the gray in his eyes burning, and I felt the truth in what he said earlier. He raised his right arm and swung it, throwing me against a wall so fast that I did not get a chance to at least blink. I braced myself, expecting my body to slam against the wall, but then the assault stopped, and I found myself inches away from the wall. "That's what's going to happen next time. I'll forget that you are my wife. You'll pay for every vile word that will ever leave your mouth. If you so much as threaten me, speak loudly at me, question my actions, I swear, one word out of that beautiful mouth of yours, and you're..." He didn't finish his sentence, but I knew what he had meant to say. Saul entered the chambers. Her black hair was loose and hanging down to her waist, and her slender body swayed gracefully as she moved. She stopped beside Wind. She was all calm, but when she saw me suspended in the air, her face registered shock for a brief moment. "Wind, dear God. Bring Princess Lamare down." I did not fear for my life then because Saul had some power over Wind. She could calm him. I was grateful for the marble floors under my feet when I landed. I felt the baby kick inside my belly. Saul moved towards me. "Your Highness, please let me." I let her touch me, and calmness crept up my body, making me lose the fear I had felt earlier because of Wind. Then Saul walked back over to Wind. Footsteps were loud against the palace floors, and I found myself staring at the stable boy. He stopped in front of Wind and prostrated. "My lord," he said in a rumbling voice. "Stand," Wind commanded. "Tell me where you gathered Princess Lamare." The stable boy stood up slowly, his hulking figure swaying awkwardly at first. When he started speaking, his body stopped moving. "I was in the stables watching out for the horses when a woman approached me. A cloak covered her face. I didn't know it was the princess, Lamare. When she commanded me to saddle Healer, I told her I couldn't do it because the horse was the princess's. Then she pulled her cloak down, and I saw her face. I haven't seen her before, but I've heard stories about how you will know it is her when you see her because her beautiful face is unparalleled by any other woman across all of Akea, and that was what I saw looking at her. Her beauty is indeed incomparable and..." A whip of air struck the stable boy's back, and he stopped talking. His badly stained teeth showed through his open mouth. "Are you professing your love to my wife, or are you telling the story of how you found her in Nivadan?" Wind asked in a hostile tone. The stable boy gritted his teeth before answering. "Forgive me, my lord. But looking at her, I knew she must be the princess. She is really lovely that when I saw her, my heart literally got caught in my chest and..." Another whip lashed at his back, but he did not flinch this time. I was unsure if I were to be flattered by his gushes or if I would feel pity over this huge man. The stable boy blinked several times before he continued. "I saddled Healer. I told Princess Lamare that taking a trip would be dangerous for the baby, but she said not to worry. Then she galloped away, leaving me staring after her." We were all listening to his account of the story, even the soldiers who brought him in and the guards on the door hung on every word he said. "And you didn't restrain her from leaving even knowing that she is putting the baby, my heir, in danger?" Wind asked. The stable boy shook his head. "No, my lord, forgive me. I was quite taken by her charms. When she left, I stared after her. I couldn't believe my luck. I've been stationed in the stables for more than a moon turn, and finally, I got to see what all the men were talking about." Wind's eyes popped. I was pretty sure he was furious about this nonsense rambling about my physical appearance. I wanted to laugh, but the situation did not call for it. A soldier was not as successful in controlling his laughter, though. Somebody snickered from my back. I wanted to see who it was, but before I could do so, I heard a loud thud followed by sounds of metal crashing against brick walls. Saul rolled her eyes. "I don't tolerate laughter in my presence," Wind said. The stable boy's body went stiff. "My lord, if I may continue?" Wind nodded. "One more word about how you were mesmerized by her looks, and you will never find a place in this palace again." "My apologies, my lord," he said nervously. "It took me a few hours before I realized that I couldn't let her leave alone, something that I shouldn't have allowed in the first place. I went to find another horse, one that wouldn't be missed in case I lost it. I was wrong, my lord. Because taking a bad horse meant that I would be slow and would reach her late. And with my weight, it posed quite a challenge for the horse." He paused. "I had difficulty following the trail once she entered the road to Nivadan because a lot of horses' hooves marked the land. And with my weight, the horse's legs got stuck in the mud more than once. I had to stop and help the horse get through the muddy ground." Somebody snickered from my back, and I was afraid that if ever Wind heard it too, another soldier would find himself badly sprawled on the floor. I had to do something. "Please skip the parts that are of no significance to us," I said and looked at the stable boy. It was a mistake. He took one look at me, and he grinned. Oh my God, he was acting like a lovesick steed. Wind lifted the stable boy in the air. "What is your name, you horrible man?" He swallowed. "Dogan Rhonda, my lord." "Dogan," he said. "I don't know what could make you tell the story faster, and I could understand your fascination with my wife. Looking at you, your mother must have regretted sleeping with your father." Then he released him, and the stable boy fell face forward on the marble floor. He rose to his feet. Dogan's eyes narrowed, and the next time he spoke, all the embellishments were removed. Facts. He only said what was necessary. He learned quickly not to temper Wind. The trails finally led me to her, in the middle of the town, and I found her as she was about to pass out. I carried her in my arms. Her horse was gone, so I had to take her on mine, but with my additional weight, we were slow in returning. After we left Nivadan, I let her ride the horse alone to make our trip faster. I'm a strong man. Being on my feet is as good as riding a horse, he finished. Wind looked at me. You see, wife. I don't know why you went there. His forehead creased, and he shrugged his shoulders. It's of no consequence to me today. I don't want to hear it. It is intriguing, yes. But it's a waste of my time. Let me make one thing clear, I have deployed eyes and ears to watch you. He waved his hand and dismissed Dogen, but before he could leave, shouts from outside the chambers were heard. Dead. The Emperor is dead. It was followed by loud footsteps entering the chambers. The soldiers were quick. They pulled their helmets down, raised their swords, and prepared for battle. Saul was immediately by my side. She took my hand and pulled me. Come on. We have to leave, she said urgently. A throng of soldiers entered and fought against the palace soldiers. I could not make out who was fighting who. They were all wearing the same armor, which could only mean that the palace soldiers were divided among themselves. The clanging of swords against swords and armor filled the air. Soldiers who were running and fighting were all that I could see. Saul was still pulling at me, but I did not want to leave. Everything was happening so fast. The stable boy picked up a sword and swung it, and a body fell to the floor. Wind was so caught off guard by the commotion that he was unable to summon air to protect himself in time. From the door, a man drew an arrow and aimed at me. Then he moved his aim and directed it at Wind. Complicated as he was, Wind was still my husband, and such a tie to him could not so easily be broken. My instinct was to protect him. No. I shouted. Dogen turned to look and saw the man with the arrow and who he was aiming at. The man let go of the arrow, and it went speeding through the air. Dogen jumped quickly to protect Wind. His massive body lifted in the air and caught the shaft before he fell to the floor. Wind's shock vanished. He opened his arms, closed his eyes, and summoned air to protect himself like it was an invisible shield. Saul and I were too far from him, so we had to run towards him and hide behind the throne. The soldiers siding with Wind were able to quench the first sign of rebellion in Akea. In a cold voice, Wind commanded the soldiers to take the rebel soldiers into the dungeons. I watched in horror as dozens of Akeans died in an instant. The palace floors were covered with blood, with Canellan soldiers' blood. I didn't know which ones belonged to the rebels and which ones to those who had sided with Wind. And why was there a rebellion in the first place? Why did somebody shout that the Emperor was dead? Had they found my father, Nordsom? A soldier was removing his sword from the body of the man who almost took Wind's life. I ran towards my husband to embrace him, but I was too slow. Seeing to his safety only came to me as an afterthought. Saul was already beside him, attending to him, seeing to it that he was not hurt. I knew she and my husband shared a special bond, but I could not bring myself to be angry. I did not understand why I was not mad at them. Instead, I ran towards Dogen, who was now in a sitting position as he removed the arrow from his back. Don't, I said. Let me. I tugged at the arrow gently, but it would not budge. There was no way I could be tender with the task. Dogen let out a yelp as I pulled the arrow out rapidly. Then I stood up and moved to see if there was anything else I could still offer the other fallen soldiers. Before I reached them, I turned around and saw Dogen smiling, holding the arrow in his hands. A few hours later, the citizens were gathered in the palace yards. The Akene flag was at half-mast. The golden bell beside the flagpole tolled, and I knew a significant announcement was to be made. The crowd was hushed. Akenes, it is with my deepest regret that I have to bring you this news. Nordsom Mendel Amark is no more, Wind began. There were cries from all around us. An elderly woman collapsed. A few curses rang out. I was frozen on the spot as Wind's words pierced my heart. But I had known this already. Regardless, his words still poisoned me as though it was the first time that I learned about it. The golden bell tolled 14 times, and I braced myself for what was to come. A new emperor would be crowned. I did not want to claim the throne because it would only mean accepting my father's fate. But for the people, for those who needed a ruler, I had to do what I must. I stepped forward in anticipation of what was to come next. I would be declared as the empress in my father's absence. Since Wind had the blessings of Nordsom already, he would be declared rightfully as my consort. A partner in ruling Akea. The elders went to where Wind stood, and they gathered around him. Akea bids Northam farewell. For what he had been to the land. For what his blood will still do to the land. For the future that will come rising after his blood, they said together. The elders lifted their hands and said, Akea welcomes McQuinstorm Aaron, the Emperor of the Two Moons, the blood that will protect and nourish Akea. Akea is his inasmuch as he is Akea's. No. I shouted. He's my consort. I am to be crowned. Wind turned to face me. His face was calm, but there was a dangerous glint to his eyes. There is no precedent for a woman to rule Akea. You will stand by me as I rule the land, he said. I looked around at the elders, at the war generals, but they did not object. An old war general rushed towards us and raised a sword at Wind. You will not have the land, he shouted as he slashed his sword at Wind. But it was in vain. Wind raised his hand, and immediately, the war general fell. There was a loud crash as the sword fell to the marble stage floor. Then the war general was lifted in front of all the people. Akeans, witness what would become of anybody who would dare question my rule, Wind announced. The sword moved and was lifted in the air. It stopped in front of the war general's face. You will burn. He shouted at Wind. Akea will not tolerate your rule. There is no place for you in this land anymore, Wind said coldly. Then he laughed mockingly and shouted, what could be more treasonous than a war general threatening the man that he should be protecting? The crowd hushed. No one dared to open his mouth to answer Wind's question because everyone knew it was meant only to taunt. Without hesitation, Wind declared, it is only right that you should find death at the edge of your own sword. At that same moment, the sword slashed across the general's neck. The severed head rolled several paces away before it stopped, the face upturned as though gazing at the heavens and asking the gods what had gone so wrong. Wind let go of his hold on the body, and it fell in a heap. The tension was so rigid that it could instantly be broken if someone else all but opened his mouth. You will end this now, Wind. You will relinquish the land to me, I yelled. He met my eyes coldly. If one general would stand behind you to offer support, I will relinquish to you what is already mine. Wind looked around at the war generals, and they did not meet his gaze. General Paterno? I said. General Paterno stared blankly at me but did not budge from where he was standing. I sank to my knees. It was all too much to take in. Northam was declared dead, but no one found his body. This had not been done before, especially when there was no proper funeral. How could they do this to my father? A war general was beheaded publicly, and no one raised an arm to defend him. My rule, crown, and heritage. What would become of me now? I had to stand behind a man to rule the land. It was never supposed to end this way. I was sweating all over, and I felt so weak. My heart twisted inside my chest. The faces of Akeans flashed in my eyes, the ruckus shrouded my hearing. I was in a panic. I searched for something to support me as I stood up. I almost fell on my knees, my emotions making me weak. The voices became louder, cheering on Wind's new rule. His smug face was all I could see. The people who cheered taunted me. My father, he was declared to be dead, and the people, they accepted it. Their once beloved ruler, now he was nothing to them. Your Highness, Saul said, her eyes rounded. I followed her gaze down to my legs and saw blood pooling around my feet. No. I shouted. I could not lose the baby too. Saul quickly moved forward and grabbed my shoulders to steady me. Your Highness, she said. Instantly, a wave of calmness spread throughout my body. I went limp. A soldier was quick to catch me, and I was rushed to the birthing room to try to save the new emperor's heir. I twisted in bed and opened my eyes, surprised that I had fallen asleep again after that horrible nightmare. A wave of cold air grazed my arms, making the hair on them stand. It took me seconds before I realized that I was inside my room in my cottage in Wawang village. This had been my home after I gave birth to Kino. The nightmares kept coming back. I did not want to sleep anymore, afraid of what would happen next, so I stood up and went to my bedside table. I lit a candle and opened a new scroll. I dipped the pen in ink and started writing the next events that would happen in Akea. I sat in front of the desk for a long time, shivering. Memories haunted me. I had to let go of this life and start planning how Kino and I could escape the Emperor's grasp. There was nothing left for me in the province of Canela. We had to move somewhere far away from the palace. Indeed, there was still a place where we could hide, where wind could not chase us. The escape had to be soon, too, before Wind asked me to write the death of people I loved. Before he asked me to take Kino's life in the scroll. That time will come, and heaven forbid, but I will not do it. Mother Akea will embrace my body first before it does my son's. I swear. Northam, I whispered. I wish you were still here. Timbuktu, why did you have to leave so soon? Courage was what I should have harnessed. But I had no ally. And my boy was so young. After I stripped him of his power, what could I do to bring it back? In every scroll I wrote, I end it with the usual, and Kino is as he always was, never a citizen of Akea. Because that was the only way I could get Wind to spare my son's life, by controlling my son's power from manifesting so that he would never be a threat to Wind. My son would never be a citizen, and as a mother, I knew nothing crueler, to let her son live a life without any power or to let him live with power if only for a short time. The problem was, the way things were, I had no choice anymore. Someone knocked on my door, and I quickly pressed my eyes with a handkerchief. The door opened, squeaking slightly on the hinges, and I saw my son. "Mother, I brought you tea. To help you sleep," he said and moved towards me. I smiled at him. "Thank you." He hugged me. "The nightmares are back?" I wanted to deny them. To tell Kino that there was no need to worry. But he was already 12 moon turns, and I had been looking everywhere for an ally. Perhaps I should not have been looking elsewhere because right in front of me was the one person who would never give up on me. I nodded, trying to hide the fear in my eyes and all the while ashamed about being afraid. Kino hugged me tighter, and I returned the favor. "Drink it, mother. It will soothe your nerves," he said. How I longed for a dose of Saul's power right now. She would know how to work my tension. I sipped from the mug. When I was halfway done, Kino took my hands. "Stop writing, mother. I'll put you back to sleep." My boy was slowly growing up to be a pleasant young man. For all the terrible things in this world, there he was, my sole reason for not giving up on life. I lay back in bed. He brushed the hair that fell on my forehead and kissed it. This time, the sun acted as a parent, and I almost cried. He moved to the desk and blew out the candle that lit the dark room. When he was about to leave, I called out to him. "Kino, please stay with me," I said in a bare whisper. He turned around and smiled. "Don't worry. I'll guard you as you sleep," he said. He carried the chair that I used when I wrote near my bed, and then he took my hand as he sat down. I smiled at him reassuringly before closing my eyes, yearning for a peaceful sleep this time. I was back in my room in the palace, lying in bed while a multitude of candles kept the room lit. The furnace was burning, leaving the room ever so slightly warm. Nowadays, nothing seems to keep the cold at bay. I pulled the blanket tighter around me as though keeping myself buried under the sheets could protect me from my husband and from the chaos that had already started. Lucia moved from the corner. When she saw that I was awake, she went out, and I heard her speaking to the soldier guarding my room. "Her Lady Highness is awake, please tell His Royal Highness," Lucia said. I choked upon hearing my new title, Lady Highness. It meant that I was the crowned emperor's consort. Otherwise, Lucia would have referred to me as Her Royal Highness. Lucia walked back in and asked me if I was hungry. I shook my head. I did not want to eat. I felt horrible. The door opened, and it was Wind wearing the red robe with gold trimmings on the waistband. It was only meant to be worn by the emperor, and I had to control myself to not spring up from the bed and tear the robes off of his body. He walked up to me and held my hand. "My wife, I worry about you," he said. "And the baby." My hand slid to my belly as though to protect the baby inside, and in response, I felt the baby kick as though to assure me it was still alive. I sighed in relief. Wind was silent for a moment. He had the gall to keep holding my hand. "I'm the emperor now, sad as it may be because that only means that Northam is gone," he said softly. "I'll need your power. To help me rule Akea." "No," I said. "There will be rebellions all over the land. Citizens will want to know what happened to Northam. I can't do it alone. But with your power, you only need to write the words down for peace to return to Akea, and it will be done." I closed my eyes. He was right. If I cared for Akea, that was what I would do. But it would also mean that Wind would hold Akea's reign for gods know how long. I was unsure if it would be wise to do so. Wind was a strong leader and could very well be a good emperor, but his temperament terrified me. And not so long ago, he betrayed me by taking the crown for himself. How much of my husband could I really trust after all that he had done? I hated that I could not use my power to change the past. It was my power's only flaw. I will not use my power to trick people into believing that you are the emperor fit to rule this land. My voice was shaking. The door slammed shut with a thud, and it gave me a start. He had used his power to seal us inside? You will do as I say if you want to have a place in Akea. The words came out cold like threats, but Wind would not harm me. It was the most natural thing in the world for emperors to want their bloodlines to continue, and Wind wanted nothing less. As long as my baby was still inside me, I was safe. No. Never, I said stubbornly. His face hardened, but when he next spoke, it was softer. You will always remember this time that I asked nicely, because when I finally figure out how to control your power, you'll regret this moment and shiver each time you remember how you let this chance pass. He paused. I'll never forget that you once denied me your power. He stood up and went outside, leaving me alone as his words lashed against my already bleeding heart. Saul was the only one who could help Wind because her power balanced him. Believing this to be true, I did the only thing I thought was fitting. In the air, I wrote, Saul will always be a righteous woman. I could not let her sink into the darkness that consumed Wind. And with Saul untarnished, I had leverage. She would be able to help Akeans. Perhaps there was no need for me to use my power to become the empress. I would take back what was mine, but not by using my power. I soon gave birth to a baby boy whom I named Kino. The news traveled quickly, but in the 2 weeks after he was born, my son had been sickly, and he would not open his eyes. When he was brought to me for his feeding, I stared at the thin body that was so frail and vulnerable that I feared for his life. He never cried, not once, and when it was his nursing time, he never grappled at my breast to suck. And only when he started feeding would I sigh with relief. Please be all right. Please live. I need you. And just like that, after whispering to him that I needed him, he opened his eyes and looked at me as though he knew he had been the only source of my strength. I stared back at him, thanking the gods for letting him live. I prayed that his health would continue improving by the day. When Lucia went in to take Kino, she said, "What lovely eyes, Your Highness. They are as green as the leaves in springtime." My heart thudded against my chest. What did you say? Second to the throne's eyes, they're as green as leaves in springtime, she repeated, puzzled. Bring him back to me, I said, panic washing over me. I took Kino in my arms and looked at him. Lucia was right. My son had green eyes. I had not noticed it before because he would not open his eyes. Looking at them now, I feared for his life, and mine. I clutched Kino tightly against me. Leave us, I commanded. Lucia hesitated, and for a moment, she stood there. Then her eyes rounded, and she clasped a hand over her mouth. She curtsied unsteadily on her feet before she turned away in a rush. I did not know what to do. If Wind sees my son's eyes, he will kill Kino. I had to move quickly. My full strength had yet to return, but fearing for both our lives made me stronger somehow. I put Kino in bed. I took a few riding clothes, dresses, and 2 blankets. These would be enough to protect us from the cold. I put them inside a pack and picked them up. There was no food. But I could find shelter somewhere in the forest and raise Kino alone. As long as I did not run out of breast milk, he would survive. We had to escape. Now. The door opened, and I saw Wind. His fists were clenched, and his shoulders tensed as he strode to where Kino lay. Wind grabbed my son, pulling him up. It's true. He shouted. My heir is a bastard. Please, Wind, don't, I begged. You dare humiliate me all over Akea? Do you know what this will do to me? It will bring disarray to the empire. It will not only start a rebellion but be a cause to lose my reign completely. He was holding Kino too tightly. Give me back my baby. Your baby, not ours, he said sarcastically. I wish Saul were here. Please, don't hurt him. Why not? This baby will destroy me and all that I ever worked hard for. And here I am, worrying like a fool over a baby that wasn't even mine. He is nothing to me. He raised his arms and let go of the baby. Kino floated. I tried to reach him, but wind was strong. He tied me with air and lifted me up. I flailed against the invisible bonds that held me. He put me right in front of Kino. My baby began to cry, angry at being lifted. I was looking directly at him, wanting to take him in my arms to make him stop, but I could not get past the binds. "Look at your boy because this is the last time you'll ever see him," he hissed. Then he swung his hand, and my body slammed against the wall. The hard slabs of the palace walls left long welts all over my back. Needles of pain shot up from my limbs to my neck as I fell onto the floor. "This is how I'll end his life. Watch, my wife. So you will learn not to spit on my face again." I was trembling with fear. "No. Please, I'll do whatever you want. There is no atonement for betrayal," he shouted. His silver eyes were burning with fire. "Please. There must be something I can do to make it right for you." Wind laughed, and I shivered at the menacing sound he made. "I'm begging you, my good emperor. My fair highness, I implore you to listen to my wails," I sobbed. That caught Wind's attention. "Renounce your power." I gasped, but I knew I had no choice. I wrote on air, "Put Kino in bed." And just like that, Kino was safely floated back to bed. I wrote again, "Stop crying," and Kino was silent in a heartbeat. Wind walked towards me and slapped me hard across the face. "You will not use your power on me," he said furiously. His eyes were back to angry slits. "I'll give you my power if you spare his life," I said. "Prove it." I did not know how to transfer my power to him, and even if I did, I could not let him take full control of it. I ran towards the table and found a scroll. I wrote on it fast. Then I showed him. "The words I write will only come true if it is burnt with lightning using the Emperor's power." He read my words, and they seemed to satisfy him. I wrote on air, "Kneel in front of me." Wind's eyes bulged, angry at what I wanted him to do. But his face registered shock when he did not find himself kneeling in front of me. My power did not work on him, just as I told him it would not work anymore. "Good. Now, you know your place," he said. "But you must spare my son's life." He stopped as if weighing things inside his head. "His power will reveal itself later. I don't want him to be a threat to me, so write this down: Kino will never be a citizen." Chills ran down my spine upon hearing Wind's words because I knew that being a citizen meant one was recognized for his power. And if Kino would never be one, he would be the only person in the land without an ability. Already, my heart was bleeding for him. "Do it," he shouted. Before I changed my mind. So I wrote the words he dictated and waited for him to burn the script. "Prove to me that it's working," he barked. I wrote on the scroll, "Saul will come to my room." I watched as he burned each word with lightning coming out of his forefinger. As soon as the last letters burned, we waited only seconds before a knock on the door came. It opened, and Saul entered, which was to my benefit because, with the sudden turn of events, I would need her to calm me down. I ran to the bed and clutched Kino to my chest. "You will leave the palace," Wind said. I was not surprised to hear it, but I did not think I was ready to go. I have not tended to myself, and I was always used to being attended to by my ladies-in-waiting. Saul looked surprised. She opened her mouth to protest. "Saul, leave us," Wind said. Saul hesitated, but she knew she could not argue with him. At least not after sensing the tension in the air. When she left, Wind said, "Write this down. Lady Lamare will be forgotten. The boy will be forgotten. Their connection to the Emperor will be no more. From now on, Lady Lamare will only be known as a royal scribe in Akea. Please, Wind, you can't strip me off of my heritage. Write it down before I change my mind and kill your bastard." "But please," I croaked, my voice shaking in terror over what he wanted me to do. "Write it down. I will now rule Akea alone. I will not shame myself with your bastard." I cried as I wrote the words down, tears falling on the scroll as I wrote, and fearing for the future that I would create for my son and me. But a future of uncertainty was better than none at all. So with my heart bleeding, I did as I was told. That was how I ended up in this remote village called Wawang, hundreds of miles away from Kino Palace, in a cottage with my son. Lamare Ariston Amark, Princess of Akea, descendant of the Amark bloodline, eldest of Northson, was not even honored in the people's memories. Never again. Since then, I have only been Lamare Amark, royal scribe to His Royal Highness, writing stories to survive for a few coins that the Emperor paid me. I woke up holding Kino's hand. His presence did not prevent the nightmare from coming back. I found him sleeping in the chair, and my heart went out to him. My son did not deserve to suffer like this. I stood up and kissed him on the forehead. It was time to start planning. Whatever it would take, I would release him. Kino would take what was his, if not his right to claim the empire, at least for the birthright of each Akene, to harness his power and become a citizen. I did not know what Kino's power was, but I swore to the gods, I would find a way to bring it back. I had to find a way to trick Wind. It would be difficult because if he saw something I wrote that he did not like, he would not burn the words, and my writing would never come true. I had to plan this carefully. I went to the kitchen and started the fire. Today, I would cook the stew for my son and me. Bread alone will not give us strength, and Kino and I need to be stronger in the days to come. End of Part 1.